Hey everyone. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at one of the coding examples for the first chapter in Regression and Other Stories. Specifically, we're going to look at the example of estimating the effects of UN peacekeeping nations. And this is just a short example based on original research by a political scientist called Paige Fortner, who conducted a study on the effectiveness of international peacekeeping. Specifically, what she did was she analyzed data from countries that had been involved in civil wars from 1989, between 1989 and 1999. And then compared countries with and without UN peacekeeping, where UN peacekeeping was involved. And so the outcome measure then is whether there was a return to civil war in the country, and if so, how long it took between the ceasefire and the civil war to kind of break out again. Okay, and of course the question is to what extent involvement by the United Nations and UN peacekeeping troops are effective in preventing civil war to break out again, or to prolong the breakout of civil war, right? And so this is an interesting example where we can dive into a little bit of the coding right away. And note that all these examples, you can look up the examples that are used in the book. You can directly look up the code on the website of the book as well. But the code in the original code for the book examples is based on base R, and what I'm going to do in these videos is I'm going to show you how to do all of this using the tidyverse packages, right? So we're going to replicate the same results, the same plots, kind of the same analysis, and I'll go through it step by step. And in addition, I will go through it using the tidyverse packages, so Ggplot and dplyr and so on. Okay. So let's jump right in. First, we want to take a brief look at the raw data, and the data that we have here is uploaded on our Studio Cloud, and I also included a codebook. There are a lot more variables and a lot more observations in here than what we need for this particular analysis. The idea here is if you want to explore a little bit more what else is in the data set and so on, play around with other, types of visualizations, you can do that directly with this data set and explore it a little bit further if you have additional ideas for comparisons and so on, okay? So here's a quick look at the raw data. Again, we're using the tidyverse, so I'm loading the tidyverse package first of all, and then I'm also loading Haven, which is a package to load stata or .dta files. So those are stata native data files. And the command to load this particular data set, which is a .dta, is read_dta. Okay, and we save this as a raw data file that is then saved as a tibble, which is a type of data frame, but that has a couple of additional features on top of the base R data frame. And we can directly print this tibble, and we see that it's 206 observations with 268 variables. So quite a lot of variables, quite a lot of observations, and we see that we have an ID, we have a conflict name, we also have additional information about when the ceasefire started, and when the ceasefire ultimately failed, and a lot of additional information. Again, take a look at the codebook if you want to explore these data a little bit further, right? But in order to kind of replicate the analysis that are reported in the book and that are discussed in the first chapter, we need only a subset of these data, and so that's what we're going to get to next. We're going to basically just subset the data and recode some of those variables to extract only the information that we actually need. What we're going to do here is we are taking the raw data file, and of course we're using the pipe operator, which we discussed in the past semester, but also I included some of those old lecture videos. So if you're kind of confused by the tidyverse kind of grammar style of R coding, make sure to check out my old lecture videos and check out the R for Data Science book that I also linked on Canvas. Okay. Then what we're going to do with our raw data file is we are going to filter only a subset of observations for which PCW is equal to 1. So those are only the subset of observations where there was actually a civil war in the time frame that we wanted to look at, right? Then we're creating some new variables, and we're using the transmute command here. In comparison to mutate, what transmute does is it basically creates a new data frame, and the new data frame will only contain the variables that we're generating in the transmute command, right? So rather than attaching new variables to our existing data frame, our existing tibble, we're creating a new data frame with only the variables that we're basically generating as part of the transmute command, okay? And what are these variables? Here we have the conflict name. We have a variable censored, which will be our variable measuring whether basically measuring whether the conflict, the civil war reemerged, whether it broke out again after the ceasefire. The reason why this is called censored, in a sense, is that data collection ended, I believe, in 2004. So basically, a lot of countries either went back, or in a lot of countries, civil war broke out again, and we have a date and when that happened. And for all other countries for which civil war didn't break out, up until the point where the data collection ended, which is in 2004, we don't quite know what's going to happen afterwards. It might be the case that civil war might break out after the data collection ended. So in that sense, there's a censoring where basically we only know that no civil war broke out until the data collection ended. Okay, so that's why we basically have this variable as censored, which is equal to true if there was no more civil war in the time period that we observe. So up to December 31st in 2004. If there was no civil war, then this is censored basically by the end of the data collection period. Okay. We also have this so-called Badness Score, and we're not really going into details. Later in the semester, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. But this is basically it's a hazard rate of a survival model that was estimated by the researcher. But we're not going to go into the details of that hazard rate yet. For us, we will just interpret this as kind of pre-existing conditions that make it more likely that civil war in a country will break out again, or less likely, or will make it more likely that it will break out again sooner, basically, right? So you can think of this as an overall measure of how bad the conditions are, and underlying conditions prior to peacekeeping missions being implemented or not. Okay. Then we have a dummy indicator here that we're basically just recoding. This original indicator is equal to 1. If there was a peacekeeping mission, it's equal to 0 if there wasn't. And we're just recoding this. This is just later to make the plotting easier. This will be basically a character vector, which is either takes the value with UN peacekeeping or without UN peacekeeping for 1 and 0, using the if-else command. Okay. Then we have CF date. That's the date when the ceasefire was or when the ceasefire started. So when the first conflict ended. And then we have fail date, and there's a little bit of a kind of date transformation that we do here that we have to go through. Um, the um, the fail date on we have a fail date for all the countries or all the conflicts where civil war broke out again, right? And that's the fail date variable that is in here, right? But the problem is, we for all cases where civil war did not break out again, this fail date variable is missing. And if you kind of explore this variable, the original raw data might not be, yeah. So here you see the fail date variable is missing for a lot of cases. This is because the civil war didn't break out after the ceasefire necessarily, okay? But we don't want to ignore those cases, and we want to take into account that we only observed conflicts up to the end of the data collection, right? So we kind of have to replace those missings with the end of the data collection, right? And so what we're doing here is we're again using the if-else command. We're checking the condition on which we check is whether fail date is missing or not. If fail date is missing, we're replacing the missing value with 2004 12/31, so December 31st, 2004. And if not, we're saving this, we're just keeping the old fail date variable, which right now, just to the original fail date variable is saved as a date variable. And in order to combine this, we have to kind of transform it into a character vector. And then ultimately later on, we transfer it into an as date, into a date vector again. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of steps kind of going through here. So make sure as you kind of walk through this code to kind of get an idea of what exactly is going on here. The idea is to replace the missing values for failed for the failing of the ceasefire, to replace these missing values with the actual censoring value, which is the end of the data collection. That's the underlying logic here. Okay. And then once we have that, we can compute the delay. And that's now the delay between the initial ceasefire and the end of the ceasefire, which could either be that a new civil war broke out, or it could be that the end of data collection was reached. Okay, and we just compute this by computing the difference. We then transform this difference into a numeric vector. Okay, and then this numeric vector is then divided by 365 in order to measure this not in days, but rather to measure it in years, okay, to make it a little bit easier to interpret. Then afterwards, some of these differences are still missing because the ceasefire date has missing values as well. And in those cases, those observations we want to ignore. So we will filter out any observations where this delay is now missing, okay? And then we can look at the resulting data frame. And the resulting data frame is now a 96 by 7 tibble. So we have 96 conflicts, 96 observations that are left from the original 206, I believe it was, with 7 variables. And the 7 variables are exactly the variables that we just created, okay, with exactly the recodings that I just walked through, okay? We have our conflict name. We have censored the dummy whether the civil war actually like returned versus not. We have our pre-existing conditions measuring the kind of likelihood of civil war returning. We have our peacekeepers dummy, CF date, fail date, and the delay, which is the difference between those two in years, right? So, for example, between 1997 and 2004, that's 7.2 years, right? Or between 1992, April and August, that's just 0.29 years, okay? So after having basically finished our data recoding, we can now look at some basic summary statistics. And specifically what we're going to look at is first, basic summary, what percentage of countries had returned to civil wars after the ceasefire. And what we're in order to kind of get the answer to that question, all we have to do is compute the average of our mean dollar of our the average of our censored variable. Again, that's a logical vector, true or false, for whether there was a return to a civil war or whether the observation was censored by the end of the data collection. That's why we call it censored. And so the 0.41 means that for 40 or 42% of those observations were censored. That means, so if 42% of the observations are censored, that means that about 58% actually returned. 58% had a return to civil war within the time period that was under consideration in this study. Okay. And now, obviously, the next question is then, is peacekeeping effective? And there are two different ways of looking at this. The first way of looking at this, of course, is to examine just comparing the average percentage of countries that return to civil war versus not, for countries that where a peacekeeping mission was present and one where it was not. Okay, and we see, of course, there's quite the difference in the percentage of countries that stayed at peace or returned to civil war. We see that with UN peacekeeping, 56% of the countries stayed at peace, compared to 34% of the countries without peacekeeping. So that suggests that peacekeeping missions were successful. We can also look at, rather than, I'm of course always moving myself, or I have to move myself out of the way here. We can also, rather than just looking at the dichotomous indicator, whether civil war returns versus not, we can also look at the time span, how long it takes for the onset of civil war, again after the ceasefire, right? In order to examine this, we again look at our peace data frame. We filter only observations that were not censored, so only observations where we know that civil war broke out again. We again group by peacekeepers, so whether or not a UN peacekeeping mission was present. And then again, we use the summarize command to compute the mean of the delay variable that we computed and the median of the delay variable that we computed. And we see here, depending on mean and median, we see, at least when we look at the median, we see that with the UN peacekeeping mission, there was a longer time span between the initial ceasefire and the return to a revival of the fighting. So it was slightly more than a year median, and without peacekeeping missions it was 0.58, so a little bit more than half a year. Okay, the the average length is a little bit reversed. We see a longer average length without UN peacekeeping. The reason here is probably that there's some outlier. If there's a single observation without UN peacekeeping that has a very long time span between the ceasefire and the revival of fighting, then that of course affects the mean, while it wouldn't affect the median as much. So in this specific case, I would probably focus on the comparison of the median length until the return of fighting. And both of these analyses then suggest, at least, or at least provide some suggestive evidence that when civil war did return, it came sooner, or in general, it came fairly soon when it did return, and it took slightly longer, at least when we're looking at the median, if there was a UN peacekeeping mission. And in general, it was less likely to return to war if there was a UN peacekeeping mission as well. Okay, so obviously, oh yeah, and in the book, there's also a little graphic that kind of illustrates this result again. We're just looking at a histogram of the years until return of civil war, and we're just going to replicate this figure really quick. If we want to replicate this figure using Ggplot, all we have to do is we again take our original piece tibble, our data frame. We filter it again only by variables that did experience a revival of fighting. So we filter by censored. The exclamation point, of course, implies that we're filtering by observations for which censored is not true. So for which there was a return to civil war. We then have our basic ggplot command where we specify one aesthetic on the x-axis. For the x-axis, we want to map the delay on the x-axis. We then add a histogram with some specifications for the breaks between individual bins of the histogram. We then want to separate this histogram by peacekeepers, which is for which we use the facet_wrap command, so that we have this comparison between countries with UN peacekeeping and countries without UN peacekeeping. We're also adding the option scales equals free_y, which means that the y-axis in both of these facets, in both of these panels, can differ from each other. In general, I would not necessarily advise you to have these y-axes flexible. If you want to enable a good comparison between both sides, you probably should have both panels on the same scale. But we're replicating what is being done or what has been done in the book, and there the scales differ. We also add a common limits for the x-axis, and then add some labels. And the result of this plot is right here. Of course, it looks slightly different than in the book, but if you compare kind of the numbers, you see that the results are the same. Only the layout changes a little bit. And we see again with UN peacekeeping, of course, there's a smaller number of cases overall. But it's we see here the distribution of years until the return of war, and without UN peacekeeping, we see actually a couple of cases, and this is kind of this outlier, so to speak. A couple of cases with longer duration until return to civil war or return of civil war, yes. So, and with UN peacekeeping, a similar distribution, but there are fewer cases that basically directly return to civil war. Okay. So ultimately, overall, the kind of the results of this study and the results of this graphic and the average comparisons suggest that peacekeeping is effective, but of course there are concerns about selection bias, right? So perhaps it's the case that peacekeepers choose kind of easy cases, so to speak. So they only get involved if they know that the likelihood of return of civil war is relatively small, right? And so on the other hand, maybe the really bad cases or really, situations where it's very likely that civil war will return, they're too dangerous that peacekeepers, can't go to those places, and that's why we kind of observe those patterns, right? And so the underlying problem here is, of course, that the treatment, if we think of UN peacekeeping as a treatment, that this treatment is not potentially not randomly assigned, right? There is a selection process as to which countries, in which countries the UN gets involved, and in which countries the UN doesn't get involved, right? And so, to the extent that we can control for these pre-existing factors that determine involvement of UN peacekeeping missions, we have to control for those in order to evaluate whether UN peacekeeping missions are ultimately effective. Okay, and that's what we're going to turn to next. The way we're going to do this now to control for, of course, there are other potential factors, political, geopolitical considerations, and so on. But what we're going to look at is this badness score that I mentioned. So and this captures like the overall kind of pre-treatment risk of returning to civil war, right? So we'll just take this as a measure of how likely it is that the country will return to civil war prior to having involvement by the United Nations versus not, right? So the way this is done in the book, in the book example, is two different scatter plots that again basically separate by whether or not there was a UN peacekeeping mission, and then looks at the relationship between this badness score on the one hand and the delay, so the time that it took between the ceasefire and the revival of fighting. Okay, and in order to replicate this plot using Ggplot, we again use our peace data frame. And we have a couple of different aesthetic mappings. On the x-axis, we have our badness score, which again is the log of this hazard rate, but we'll just take that as a given. On the y-axis, we have our delay, so the time that it took for a revival of fighting. And then we have two additional mappings, color and shape. And we're going to use those to distinguish cases, because we have this delay variable for both cases that returned to civil war and cases that didn't, and we use color and shape to distinguish those two cases. We then add geometry, basic points for a scatter plot for those aesthetic mappings, and then again divide this plot by peacekeepers, by the variable indicating whether there was a peacekeeping mission or not. And then we add some labels. We can look at those here. And then we omit the legend for our censored variable. Okay, just to replicate the plot in the book. Okay, and the result is right here. This is figure 1.4 in the book. We see here on the left panel conflicts where with UN peacekeeping. On the right, we see conflicts without UN peacekeeping. On the x-axis, we have this pre-treatment measure of problems with the country. So this is this badness score, which kind of you could think about as a kind of pre-treatment likelihood of return to civil war. And on the y-axis, we have the delay in years before return of conflict. And here triangles where conflict did not return, right? So all the blue triangles up here and up here, those are conflicts that were actually censored. So we computed a delay, but the end of that delay is determined by the end of the data collection, not the actual return of civil war, okay? And once we kind of look at this comparison between UN peacekeeping, with UN peacekeeping and without UN peacekeeping, we can see that, of course, there's a relationship between this badness score and the time or time delay that it takes for return of conflict. So countries where that had harsher preconditions were more likely to return to civil war sooner. So that's one finding. But the other finding is that that it's not the case that with UN peacekeeping only kind of selected the easy cases, right? So there were actually a lot of UN peacekeeping missions that actually were on average were actually involved, or UN peacekeeping was actually involved in civil wars that actually on average had worse preconditions, so to speak, right? There's no selection towards easy cases, so to speak, right? So the concern that this confounding factor kind of jeopardizes our inference about the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping missions is kind of alleviated to some extent based on these additional analysis, okay? So as a result, adjusting for this kind of badness score in the analysis ultimately actually increases the estimated beneficial effects of peacekeeping, at least during the period of this study, okay? Because peacekeeping was actually performed in tougher conditions on average, and despite the fact that it was performed in tougher conditions, it actually reduced both the likelihood of onset of civil war and it increased the time, the delay until civil war returned. Okay. This comparison, in order to make this comparison, is this is the figure that is in the book, but you could argue that maybe this is not the best kind of visualization to make this specific comparison. One thing we can do to make this a little bit more clear is to focus directly on conflicts that returned and only look at the delay for conflicts where civil war returned. And so I'm doing this here in a quick kind of variation of this plot. We're only filtering now censored cases. Okay. I'm just seeing that I should have filtered by not censored cases. That's fine. I will just fix the slide before I upload them because the results look fairly similar. Of course, we want to look at cases where the conflict returned. Of course, that would be where censored is false, so that would have to include an exclamation point right here, and then look at this relationship between pre-treatment measures of problems with the country and delay. And in the slides that I'm uploading, that I'll upload, you'll see that result. But what it will show is that that UN peacekeeping missions didn't select on like lower badness scores, and you can actually see a similar pattern here, right? So if you just look on the x-axis, the pre-treatment measure of problems with the country, you'll see here also that all these observations out here are observations there was UN peacekeeping, right? So we see actually, even if we focus on the wrong cases that I didn't want to focus on, which is the ones that didn't return to civil war, we'll see that on average the conflicts where UN peacekeeping missions were performed were the ones that were actually that had worse preconditions. Okay, so you see that result here as well. But I'm gonna fix this filtering before I upload the slides. Okay. All right, so this concludes our coding example from this chapter. In the next video, I'm going to talk about data and measurement.